She had already made up her mind that morning. If the rancher raised his rifle, she would not beg. Her fingers were wrapped around 3 warm eggs, her stomach knotted so hard it made her feel sick, and all she could think about was her little boy coughing in his sleep and her little girl pretending she was not hungry. When the man's voice came from behind her, low and even, she shut her eyes for one hard second and held still. She did not run. She did not cry. She turned slowly with the eggs in both hands and looked at the kind of man who could end a life before sunrise and never be late for breakfast. He studied her face, then the eggs, then the torn satchel hanging from her shoulder. "You stealing?" he asked, "or trying not to bury somebody this week?" She swallowed once. The truth sat in her throat like a stone. Then she answered anyway. "I came to trade," she said. "I got a rabbit in the bag. My children need food." The man did not move for a long moment. The quiet between them stretched so tight she could hear her own breath. Then he did something stranger than anger. He lowered the rifle, leaned it against the chicken coop, and looked at her like he was measuring more than what was in her hands. "You can work for your meals," he said. "Or if you need something steadier than that, you can stand beside me in church the next time the preacher rides through." Her grip slipped. One egg fell and broke in the dirt at her feet. She stared at him, unable to tell which frightened her more, his mercy or his meaning. What kind of man offered a starving woman a job with one breath and marriage with the next? Her name was Mara Bell, though most days lately she felt more like a shadow than a woman. She stood in the half-light between the coop and the barn, her dark hair pinned back badly, her skirt hemmed stiff with old mud, and tried to make sense of the man in front of her. He looked to be a little past 30, broad through the shoulders, quiet in the way of men used to long hours alone. His face was not soft, but it was steady. That steadiness unsettled her more than temper would have. Angry men were easier to read. Kind ones asked something from the heart, and the heart was the one thing Mara could not afford to lose again. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Wyatt Granger." He said it plain, like that should be enough. Maybe out here sometimes it was. Names carried more weight on the prairie than papers did. She glanced toward the west tree line where her children waited in the broken lean-to she had found 2 nights before. Her daughter would be awake by now, keeping her brother close, trying to act older than 7. The thought of them alone made her chest tight. "You got children with you," Wyatt said. It was not a question. Mara nodded once. 2, a girl and a boy. "How far?" "About a mile." He bent, picked up the unbroken egg she had dropped, and turned one over in his hand. His voice stayed calm. "Then go get them. Bunkhouse is dry. Stove still draws. You all can eat first, and after that you can decide if you're working or if you're still looking at me like I lost my mind." That almost made her laugh, almost. Instead she stood there staring, waiting for the edge hidden under the offer. Men were not like this, not the ones she had known since her husband died. They wanted payment before kindness. They wanted gratitude that could be collected in pieces. Wyatt only waited, no reach for her arm, no hungry look, no impatience. "Why," she asked, "would you do that for strangers?" His gaze met hers. "Because you got caught with eggs and still try to pay for them." The answer landed somewhere deep in her, somewhere sore. She looked away fast. Pride had kept her upright this long, but hunger had a way of chewing through pride. So did weariness. She gave one short nod and turned toward the cottonwoods. Her boots moved faster than she wanted them to. She was afraid that if she slowed down, the whole offer would vanish like heat over dirt. When she came back, her daughter was holding her brother's hand so tightly the boy's knuckles had gone pale. The little girl, Lottie, lifted her chin the way frightened children do when they are trying to borrow courage from thin air. The boy, Caleb, pressed a ragged wooden horse against his chest and hid half behind his sister's skirt. Mara stopped at the foot of the ranch house steps and felt shame rise hot in her throat. The children looked too thin. There was no hiding that. Their coats were patched beyond patching, and Caleb's cough had left his face dull and tired. Wyatt stood on the porch with his arms folded, not stern, not smiling, just there, waiting. He came down the steps and crouched so he was closer to the children's height. "You hungry?" he asked. Caleb nodded before Lottie could stop him. That finally pulled the smallest change across Wyatt's face. Not a grin, just something gentler around the eyes. "Good," he said. "Makes it easier to do justice to breakfast." He led them to the bunkhouse beside the barn. It was small, plain, and cleaner than Mara had expected. One bed stood against the far wall. A narrow shelf held a lamp, 2 folded quilts, and a tin basin. There was a little iron stove in the corner and a wood box half full beside it. Lottie looked at the bed as if it were made of gold. Caleb reached for the nearest quilt and rubbed it between his fingers. "You'll have to crowd together," Wyatt said, "but nobody here sleeps wet." Mara turned toward him. "I don't know how to thank you. Best way is with honesty and decent biscuits." The words were so dry that she blinked, then let out a small sound that had once been laughter. Wyatt noticed. She could tell he noticed, but he did not make anything of it. He only nodded toward the main house. "Come on, kitchen's warmer." The house smelled of coffee, ash, and old pine boards. The kind of smell that told a person life had been lived there day after day without show. Mara stood at the doorway for a second too long, struck by the sight of a real table, a clean stove, a row of jars catching morning light. Caleb sat the minute he was told. Lottie stayed standing until Mara touched the back of her shoulder. Wyatt moved around the kitchen with easy purpose, setting out biscuits left from the day before, reheating beans, slicing salt pork thin so it would stretch. He did not ask questions while the children ate. Mara noticed that. He let them fill themselves first. Lottie tried to take small bites like a lady. Caleb forgot all such things by the second biscuit. Mara kept waiting for the sharp pain of humiliation to come, but it never quite did. Hunger was still there, so was caution. Yet under both of those, something stranger began to stir. Relief. It was such a dangerous feeling she almost pushed it away. Wyatt poured coffee into a chipped mug and slid it toward her. "Now tell me your name." "Maribel." "Where from?" "Missouri." He leaned one shoulder against the table. "And the children's father?" "Dead 2 winters." He accepted that without ceremony. No pity face, no muttered apology, just a nod like grief was a thing he recognized and did not need explained. Outside, a horse stamped in the barn. A hen clucked near the yard. Caleb's chewing slowed as warmth and food began to pull at his eyelids. "You can cook," Wyatt said, watching the way Mara's eyes kept drifting to the stove and pantry. "I can tell by how many times you've looked at my flour." That startled her into a real smile, brief and tired. "I can cook, sew too, clean, mend harness if it's not too far gone." "Good," he set his mug down. "Then the work offer stands." "And the other one?" He did not answer at once. That made her look at him harder. Most men would have rushed in where they wanted to be bold. Wyatt only held her gaze and chose his words with care. "The other one stands too," he said. "But not because you're desperate. I won't have that hanging over either of us. You work here first. You learn me. I learn you. Then if I ask again, you'll know what you're answering." The room went still. Even Lottie looked up at that. Mara felt heat move into her face, not because of romance, not yet, because respect had become so rare she barely knew what to do with it. Wyatt was offering her something more frightening than shelter. He was offering choice. She wrapped both hands around the warm mug. "Then I choose work." "For now," he said. "For now," she answered. He tipped his head once. The agreement settled between them like a board fitted true, not flashy, solid. Wyatt rose, took his hat from the peg by the door, and headed outside to the yard. At the threshold he paused and looked back at her, at the children, at the kitchen that already somehow felt less empty than it must have the day before. "Dinner's at sundown," he said. "And Mara." She looked up. "When I said I don't joke much before breakfast, that was the truth, so don't go thinking I forget what I mean." Then he stepped out into the morning, leaving her with the smell of coffee, the sound of her children breathing easier, and one hard question she had no business letting into her heart. What if this place was not just a stop on the road? What if this was the first morning of something neither of them knew how to name yet? The first week passed like that, quiet on the outside and full underneath. Mara rose before dawn each morning and crossed the yard while the sky was still dark blue and the grass still wet with dew. By the time Wyatt came in from the barn, the fire was awake, coffee was hot, and something plain but filling was already on the stove. She moved through the kitchen with the ease of someone who had spent years feeding other people before she ever thought of feeding herself. Her hands remembered what the rest of her body had nearly forgotten. Stir, knead, salt, wait. Lottie helped without being told, setting spoons on the table and folding dishcloths with fierce little focus. Caleb mostly wandered where warmth followed, dragging his wooden horse over the floorboards or falling asleep in a chair with one boot half off. Wyatt watched all of it without making a show of watching. He noticed the way Mara counted scraps before throwing them out. He noticed how she saved bacon grease in a tin and stretched flour like a miracle worker. He noticed how she still startled at sudden footsteps, though she tried to hide it. That first Sunday after she came, he found her outside the bunkhouse at dawn, beating dust out of one of the quilts with more force than the job called for. The sound cracked through the cold air. "You planning to kill it?" he asked, "or clean it?" She lowered the quilt and looked over at him. The morning light caught the hollows under her eyes. "Depends how the day goes." That almost pulled a smile from him. Almost. He carried a split armload of wood past her and set it by the door. Storm might roll in by evening. Get an extra kettle on. She glanced toward the west. The clouds were still low and far, but she believed he knew weather the way some people knew scripture. All right. He turned to go, then paused. "You sleep at all last night?" It was such a plain question that it disarmed her. Mara tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Enough." "That's not what I asked." She looked down at the quilt. For a moment she considered lying. Then she remembered what he had said about honesty. Caleb coughed half the night. Wyatt gave one short nod. "I'll ride into Grayson after chores. Doc there keeps a syrup for chest trouble. Tastes bad, works." Her head snapped up. "You don't have to do that." "I know." That answer left no room for argument. He simply went on toward the barn, broad shoulders easy under the morning light, like helping was not something noble at all, like it was only the next thing to do. Mara watched him go and felt that same dangerous shift inside her. Relief, gratitude, a beginning of trust. She did not like how much she wanted to lean on it. By noon the wind had changed. It came through the cottonwoods with a dry hiss, and the yard took on that restless look land gets before weather breaks. Mara had bread rising near the stove and beans simmering low when Wyatt came in from the east fence with dust on his boots and a shallow scrape on his forearm. He washed at the basin without comment. Mara saw the blood anyway. "You catch a nail," she said. "Fence wire." "Sit down." He looked at her once, measuring the tone. Then he sat. Mara fetched a rag, warm water, and the small jar of salve she had been saving. His forearm was hard with muscle, browned by sun, the scrape angrier than he was treating it. She cleaned it with steady hands. Wyatt did not flinch, though the muscle jumped once under her fingers when the rag touched raw skin. "You've done this before," he said. "My husband was always cutting himself on wood or tools." The words landed softer than she expected. Not because she loved speaking of her husband. She did not. There had been kindness in that marriage and hardship too, but not this quiet steadiness. Not this feeling that she was safe to say only as much as she wished. Wyatt waited. He did not ask the dead man's name. He did not ask how long Mara had grieved. She appreciated him for that more than she meant to. Lottie came in then carrying 2 eggs in the fold of her apron like treasure. "Found these by the shed." Wyatt looked at the eggs, then at Mara, and one side of his mouth moved. "Looks like theft runs in the family." Lottie froze. Mara's spine went stiff. Then Wyatt reached out and tapped the edge of one eggshell with his finger. "Only difference is these were earned." Lottie smiled so fast it almost hurt to see. She hurried to the kitchen table and set the eggs down with careful pride. Mara looked back at Wyatt, and for a second something passed between them. A silent understanding. He had seen the fear in the room and cut it loose before it could settle. That night the storm finally came. Rain hit the roof in sharp bursts, then harder, until the whole bunkhouse seemed to breathe with it. Caleb coughed deep in his chest and curled against Mara under the quilt. Lottie slept with one hand twisted in the edge of her mother's sleeve. Mara stayed awake listening to the wind push at the walls. Shelter could still feel temporary even with a roof overhead. She had learned that the hard way. More than once in the last 2 years she had believed a place might hold, only to be reminded that poor widows and hungry children were welcome only until they became an inconvenience. Somewhere after midnight a knock came at the bunkhouse door. Mara sat up at once. "Who is it?" "Wyatt." She rose quietly so she would not wake the children and opened the door only a crack. Rain smell came in first, then lantern light. Wyatt stood there with his hat dark from the storm and a bottle in one hand. "Chest syrup," he said. "Town took longer than I figured." Mara stared at him. "You rode in this weather." "It got bad on the way back." That was all he said, as if that explained nothing and everything. She opened the door wider. Wyatt stepped in but stayed near the entrance, careful of the muddy floorboards. Caleb stirred in the bed and coughed again, that deep, rough sound that had kept Mara on edge for nights. Wyatt looked toward him, then held out the bottle. "1 spoon now, another by morning if he needs it." Mara took it from him, her fingers brushing his. His hand was cold from rain. "Thank you." He glanced once around the bunkhouse, at the bed crowded with children, at the stove fighting the damp, at Mara standing there in lamplight with tired eyes and hair half loose from sleep. His face changed almost too little to see. Not pity, not exactly, something closer to anger on her behalf. "You don't have to stay out here forever," he said quietly. She knew what he meant. The main house had more room, thicker walls, a better stove. He had not offered it before because he was careful with lines, and she knew that too. Mara looked down at the bottle in her hand. "We're fine," she said, "for now." The words came from him this time. She looked up and found his gaze already on her. Rain battered the roof. Caleb coughed again. Lottie shifted in sleep. Wyatt tipped his chin toward the boy. "Get that in him." She nodded. He started to leave, then paused at the door. "You scared the first day I found you." Mara gave a tired breath that nearly became a laugh. "I was holding your eggs." "No," he shook his head once. "You looked like somebody who'd been let down too many times to know where to set her weight." The truth of it struck so cleanly that Mara could not answer. Wyatt opened the door, and cold air rushed in around him. "Sleep some if you can," he said. "Nothing's getting through that yard tonight without meeting me first." Then he stepped back into the rain. She stood there long after he was gone, the bottle warm now from her hand, her heart beating with a strange, uneven force. No one had said something so plain to her in a very long time. No one had looked at her and seen not just hunger, not just need, but the weariness underneath both. The syrup worked. By morning, Caleb's cough had loosened, and some of the gray had left his little face. Mara found Wyatt out near the barn mending a latch bent by the storm. The earth was thick with mud. The air smelled clean and torn open. He straightened when she approached, hammer still in hand. "How's the boy?" "Better." He nodded, satisfied, then went back to the latch as if there were nothing more to say. Mara stood a moment, not sure why she had come out there except that thank you felt too small to leave unsaid. "I meant what I said before," she told him, "about not wanting charity." Wyatt drove in another nail. "Good." She frowned. "Good." He set the hammer down and faced her. "I don't want somebody staying here because I fed them at the right time. I want truth. If you hate it here in a month, you can say so. If you want to leave, you can leave. If you want work, I got work. If one day you want more than work, that'll be because you chose it with your eyes open." Mara held his gaze. Wind moved a loose strand of hair across her cheek. For 1 second she forgot to hide what she was feeling. Not love, not yet, but the hard beginning of wanting to believe him. Wyatt seemed to see that too. His expression softened just a little. "I haul lumber from town on Friday," he said. "Need another pair of hands, you know horses." I know enough not to stand behind them. That's a fair beginning. She looked past him toward the pasture where the grass moved in long gray-green waves under the sky. This place still did not feel fully real, but every hour she stayed, another part of her began to settle. In the work, in the routine, in the quiet sound of Wyatt's voice moving through a room without trying to own it. That evening after supper, Lottie and Caleb fell asleep side by side on a pallet by the stove in the main house. Rain had left the bunkhouse damp again, and Wyatt had told Mara to bring them over until the place dried. He sat at the table mending a leather strap while Mara folded washed cloths beside the fire. The room was still except for the soft pop of burning wood. "You miss Missouri?" he asked after a while. She kept folding. "No." That made him look up. Mara set another cloth in the pile, smoothing it twice though it needed no smoothing. "I miss who I was before it all went wrong," she said. "Not the place." Wyatt considered that. "That's different." "Yes." Silence settled again, but it did not feel empty. Mara looked toward the children sleeping by the fire. Lottie's hand rested across her brother's chest like she was keeping him tethered. Mara's throat tightened. Wyatt followed her gaze. "They're good kids." "They had to be." He set the leather strap down. "Maybe they don't anymore." Mara turned to him slowly. The firelight moved over his face, catching the lines weather and solitude had left there. She saw then that this man did not speak often because he wasted nothing, not even words. When he said something, it came from a place that had been weighed first. She did not trust easily. She had earned that caution. But sitting there in the warm room, with her children safe at last, and a man across from her who never pressed when gentleness would do, she felt a thin crack open in the wall she had built inside herself. Cold air had lived in that wall a long time. Now, for the first time, light was getting through. Outside, the yard was silver under a rising moon. Inside, the fire burned low and steady. Mara folded the last cloth, set it down, and looked across the room at Wyatt Granger. The man who had caught her stealing eggs had not asked for payment. He had asked for honesty, work, time, choice. Those were not small things. Out on the prairie, they might have been the biggest things a person could offer. And though she would never have said it aloud that night, she was beginning to understand something that scared her more than hunger ever had. She wanted this place to keep holding. She wanted him to mean every word he had said. Worse than that, she was starting to hope he did. Friday came with a hard, clear sky and a wind that carried the smell of dry grass and wagon dust. Mara stood in the yard before sunrise, tying her shawl tighter while Wyatt hitched the team to the wagon. The horses shifted in the traces and blew white breath into the cold morning air. Lottie stood on the porch with Caleb, both still half asleep, both wrapped in quilts. Mara hated leaving them, even for a few hours, but the woman from the next spread over had agreed to keep an eye on them until noon. It was only a short ride. Still, a mother's mind did not measure danger by miles. It measured it by love. Wyatt finished checking the harness and glanced her way. "You sure you want to come?" "You asked me to help." "I did." "Then I'm coming." Something like approval moved across his face. He did not praise her for it. Mara appreciated that. Too much praise for ordinary work always felt false to her. Wyatt climbed up to the front bench and held out a hand. She hesitated only a second before taking it. His grip was warm and firm, steady enough to make the climb feel easy. Once she settled beside him, he clicked to the horses and the wagon rolled out through the gate. For the first mile, neither of them spoke much. The prairie opened wide around them, grass bending in long pale waves, the sky so broad it made a person feel small in the best and worst way. Mara held the edge of the seat with one hand and watched the land pass. She had traveled west through country like this with grief sitting beside her and two hungry children behind her. That had been a cruel kind of journey. This one felt different. The road was still rough. The wind still cut sharp. But for once she was not traveling toward uncertainty. She was riding back to a place that might actually want her there. Wyatt flicked the reins lightly. "You drive." "I can if the horses are decent." These two are decent enough if you don't give them a reason to doubt you." He handed her the reins without another word. Mara took them and settled them in her palms. The leather felt worn and familiar. For a few minutes she forgot to be careful with herself. The team responded well. The wagon moved smooth under her hands. She heard Wyatt give a low grunt beside her, and when she glanced over, she found him looking ahead with that same nearly hidden approval. "My father taught me when I was 10, she said. "Horses. Wagons, mules, anything that pulled." "You miss him." Mara kept her eyes on the road. "Some days." Wyatt nodded once. He did not ask for more. The quiet between them had changed over the past week. It no longer felt like two strangers holding back. It felt more like room being made. The town of Red Hollow came into view slow and flat, a row of weathered buildings leaning into the wind as if they had been arguing with it for years. The mercantile sat near the middle, with the blacksmith shop a little farther down and the church beyond that. A few riders moved through the main road. A dog slept under a wagon wheel. A woman in a brown coat swept dust off a porch that would be dusty again in 10 minutes. Mara felt the old tightening in her chest the second they rolled in. Towns had a way of looking at widows like they were a lesson in what not to become. Wyatt must have sensed it. "Stay close," he said quietly. She almost bristled at that. Then she saw that he was not speaking to her like a child. He was reading the room before they had even stepped into it. She gave one short nod. They bought the lumber first. Wyatt spoke to the yard man, checked the boards himself, and loaded the wagon with quick practiced motions. Mara helped stack and tie the load down. No one bothered her there. Men in lumber yards noticed hands before faces. Hers worked, so they left her be. The trouble came when they stepped into the mercantile. The bell over the door gave a weak ring. Mara moved toward the cloth and thread while Wyatt went for lamp oil, flour, and nails. She kept her head down, touching each bolt of fabric with careful fingers, adding up cost without asking. She had just found a plain brown wool that would hold up through winter when she heard two women near the back counter lower their voices the way people do when they mean to be overheard. "That's her. The one staying out at Granger's place." "So I heard. Came in half-starved with a pair of children and no husband." Mara's hand went still on the fabric. Heat climbed her neck. The women were not saying anything she had not lived through. That did not make it easier to hear. "Men alone lose sense," one of them whispered. "Give a drifter a roof and next thing she'll be wearing his name." Mara set the cloth down and turned before she could stop herself. The women were both well-fed, well-dressed, and looked at her with that flat, polite cruelty respectable people often carried best. For 1 second the whole store went silent in her ears. Shame hit first, then anger, then the old instinct to grab her children and keep moving before the world could spit her back out. She did not realize Wyatt had crossed the room until he was beside her. "You need something?" he asked the women. His tone was so even it made Mara's skin prickle. One woman lifted her chin. "Only making conversation, Mr. Granger." "Then make better use of it." The store clerk suddenly found great interest in a sack of beans. The women stiffened. Wyatt did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply stood there, broad and quiet, with the kind of stillness that made foolishness look small. The second woman gave a thin smile. "People are bound to talk." "They can talk outdoors," Wyatt said. "My business stays mine." Mara looked at him then, really looked. He had stepped between her and the whole sting of it without turning it into spectacle, without once acting embarrassed of her. Something inside her shook loose at that, not because he defended her, because he did it as if there were no question he would. They finished their shopping in silence. Outside, Wyatt loaded the sacks and tins into the wagon while Mara stood with the folded brown wool in her arms, staring at the boards beneath her boots. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. He tied off the rope. "Yes, I did." "They were only talking." He looked up, words still hit. She had no answer for that. He took the fabric from her, set it gently with the rest of the goods, and then climbed onto the wagon bench. Mara stood there a second longer, trying to settle herself. Red Hollow looked the same as it had 10 minutes before. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Because for once, when the world tried to put her in the dust, someone had stood beside her instead of stepping away. The ride home was quieter than the ride in. Not strained, just full. Mara watched the ruts in the road and the shadow of the wagon wheels moving beside them. After a while, Wyatt held the reins out toward her again. She took them without comment. "You mad?" he asked. "At them, yes." "At me?" She frowned. "Why would I be?" He looked out over the prairie. "Some people don't like being defended." Mara let that sit for a few breaths. "I don't like being pitied." "I wasn't pitying you." "I know." He glanced at her then, and for a moment the air between them changed. It was not romance exactly. Not yet. It was recognition. The kind that comes when two people finally understand the shape of one another's wounds. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun had dropped low enough to turn the grass gold. Lottie came running from the porch the minute she saw the wagon, Caleb stumbling after her with his toy horse in one hand. Mara climbed down and dropped to her knees before they even reached her. Lottie flung both arms around her neck. Caleb pressed into her side so hard he nearly knocked her over. "We was good," Lottie said at once. "Mrs. Pritchard gave us apple slices and Caleb only cried once." "I did not," Caleb said. Wyatt came around the wagon with the sacks in his arms. "That one looks like a man who cried at least twice." Caleb stared at him, then laughed in spite of himself. Lottie laughed too. The sound lifted into the evening air, light and surprised. Mara looked up from the children and found Wyatt watching them. His face had gone quiet again, but there was warmth there now. More than before. That night after the children were asleep, Mara sat on the porch step with the brown wool folded in her lap. The moon had not risen yet. The yard lay dark except for the lantern glow spilling from the kitchen window. Wyatt came out carrying 2 tin cups and handed one to her. "Coffee's gone cold," he said, "but it's still coffee." She took it, their fingers brushed. Neither moved away fast. After a while she said, "When those women were talking in town, I wanted to disappear." Wyatt sat beside her on the step, close enough that she could feel the heat of him through the night chill. "I figured. I used to think if I kept my head down long enough, people might leave me be. They won't." "No." He took a slow drink from his cup. "You can't build your life around other people's meanness." Myra looked out at the yard. "I'm trying to remember how to build one at all." The words came out lower than she meant them to, honest, tired. Wyatt set his cup down on the step beside him. "Then start with what holds," he said. She turned to him. "And what is that?" He looked straight at her, and there was no humor in his face now, no dryness to soften the moment. Only truth. "This land, that house, your children, my word." Mara felt the breath catch in her chest. He had given her room since the day she came. Room to work, room to choose, room to stay frightened if she needed it. But now, sitting beside her in the dark with his shoulder almost touching hers, he was giving her something harder to refuse. Certainty. She looked down at the cup in her hands so he would not see how much that had moved her. "You speak like a man who means to be believed." "I do." The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Somewhere in the barn a horse shifted and stamped once. Mara sat with the sound of his words inside her and understood that the road between them had shortened again that day, not because he had offered more, because he had proven what was already there. When she finally rose to go inside, Wyatt stood with her. For one brief second neither of them moved. The porch felt smaller somehow, the night closer. Mara could have stepped back, she knew that. Instead she stayed where she was. "Good night, Wyatt." "Good night, Mara." She turned and went in before her courage could change shape on her. But later, lying awake in the bunkhouse with Caleb breathing soft beside her and Lottie curled near the wall, she touched her fingers to her lips without thinking. Not because he had kissed her. He had not. It was because something had passed between them anyway. Something quiet. Something dangerous. Something that no longer felt like a question waiting far off in the future. It felt near now. The first frost came 3 nights later. Mara woke before dawn to a silence so deep it felt like the whole prairie was holding its breath. She sat up in the bunkhouse bed and listened. No rain on the roof, no wind pressing at the boards, just stillness. Caleb slept curled against her side, warm and loose now that the cough had mostly gone. Lottie lay near the wall with both hands tucked under her cheek, looking younger in sleep than she ever allowed herself to look awake. Mara eased out from under the quilt, pulled on her dress and shawl and stepped outside. The yard was silver from end to end. Frost lay over the grass, the fence rails, the water bucket, the barn roof. Even the old wagon wheel near the shed had a thin white rim along its spokes. Mara stopped on the step and stared. Cold had a way of making the world look clean for 1 hour before it turned cruel. She knew that better than most. Still, there was beauty in it too. The kind that hurt to look at if a person was tired enough. Wyatt was already awake. She found him near the woodpile splitting kindling by lantern light, his sleeves rolled, breath rising in pale clouds. The axe fell in steady strokes, nothing wasted, nothing hurried. He looked up once when he heard her boots on the frozen ground. "Pump handles stiff," he said. "Use the kettle water first." Mara nodded. "You're up early." "So are you." She almost smiled, couldn't sleep. He studied her face a moment in that quiet way of his. Then he set another log on the block. "Dreams." She did not answer right away. Frost cracked under her boot when she shifted her weight, some. Wyatt brought the axe down clean, bad ones. Mostly old ones. He let that stand. She appreciated him for it. Too many people heard pain and rushed at it with questions, as if grief were a knot they had a right to untie. Wyatt was different. He left room for silence the way other men left room for furniture. Mara carried kindling into the main house and stirred life into the stove. By the time the children came in rubbing sleep from their eyes, the kitchen was warming and cornmeal was bubbling in the pot. Lottie moved slowly at first, still wrapped in the last of sleep, but perked up when Mara handed her a spoon and told her to stir. Caleb sat on a chair near the fire and watched the steam rise from his cup like it was a show put on just for him. Wyatt came in a few minutes later with cold in his coat and frost still clinging to the brim of his hat. He washed up at the basin, then took his place at the table without ceremony. That had become part of the strange comfort of the house. No one made speeches over food. No one acted like every meal needed to prove something. They simply sat, ate, passed biscuits, reached for coffee. It felt plain, it felt good. Halfway through breakfast, Wyatt looked at Mara over the rim of his cup. "Need to ride the lower pasture today. North fence took some wind last week. Wanna come?" Lottie looked up at once. Mara saw it, so did Wyatt. "I can stay with them," Mara said. Wyatt shook his head once. "Mrs. Pritchard said she'd keep an eye on them if needed, only a few hours." Mara hesitated. She still hated leaving the children even with someone nearby. That fear might never leave her. But the truth was simple. She wanted to go. She wanted to see more of the land she was helping keep alive. She wanted to be beside Wyatt in a place that was not kitchen walls and chores. Lottie saved her from having to answer quickly. "We'll be fine." The girl said it with a small firmness that was more moving than she knew. Caleb nodded as if being asked meant he had been made part of some important agreement. Wyatt broke off a piece of biscuit. "There you have it." Mara gave him a look. "You let them outvote me easy." They made a strong case. The ride out after breakfast was cold enough to sting her face. Wyatt saddled a sorrel mare for Mara and mounted his gray gelding with the easy grace of a man whose body knew horses better than chairs. For a while they rode without speaking, letting the quiet prairie open around them. Frost still clung to the shaded patches of grass, and the low sun turned the creek line pale gold. A hawk circled far overhead. Somewhere in the distance cattle moved like dark commas across the land. Mara pulled her shawl tighter. "You always talk this little." "When it suits me. And when it doesn't." He glanced over. "Then I talk enough." That earned a laugh from her before she could stop it. The sound startled both of them a little. Wyatt did not smile fully, but something eased in his face. Mara looked ahead quickly, unsettled by how natural it had felt. They reached the lower pasture near midday. One section of fence had indeed loosened, two posts leaning where the last storm had softened the ground. Wyatt dismounted, checked the wire, and set to work without complaint. Mara held the post steady while he drove it deeper. They moved together better than she expected. He would hand her twine or tools without needing to explain. She would brace when he needed pressure on the line. No fuss. No wasted instruction. It was work, but there was a rhythm in it that felt almost companionable. At one point, the wire slipped and sliced across the heel of Mara's palm. Not deep, but enough to bring sharp blood to the skin. Wyatt caught her wrist before she could hide it. Hold still. It's nothing. That's blood. I noticed. He tore a strip from the clean rag in his saddlebag, wrapped her hand, and tied it snug with rough, careful fingers. Mara stood very still while he did it. His head was bent. His hands were warm. The contact was brief and practical, yet something in her chest tightened all the same. "You always this bossy?" she asked softly. "When somebody's bleeding on my fence, yes." She looked at him. "Your fence." He lifted his gaze then, and his eyes held hers for one long second. "Didn't say only mine." The words were plain. They still landed deep. They finished the repairs and rode farther south to check a snare line near the creek. The land dipped there, the air cooler and sharper with the smell of damp earth and leaf rot. Wyatt dismounted first and crouched by the nearest trap. A rabbit hung caught in the wire. He freed it quick and clean, then reset the snare with practiced hands. Mara watched him work. "You ever get tired of doing everything alone?" she asked. He kept his eyes on the wire. "Sometimes." "Why didn't you marry before now?" That question surprised even her. She almost took it back. Wyatt straightened slowly, the rabbit hanging from one hand. "Thought about it once," he said. "Long time ago." "What happened?" "She wanted a town man, a cleaner life." Mara waited. Wyatt gave one small shrug. "I had dirt under my nails and no wish to apologize for it." There was no bitterness in the way he said it. That moved her more than if there had been. She took the rabbit when he handed it to her and looked out over the creek bed, over the wide, spare country that made some people feel free and others feel abandoned. "My husband was kind," she said after a while, "but he was not built for hardship. Every bad season took something out of him." Wyatt did not interrupt. By the time he died, I think part of him had already been gone a long while. She swallowed and kept her eyes on the water. "I don't say that cruelly. It's just true." "No," Wyatt said quietly. "It's not cruel to tell the truth." She turned toward him then. The wind moved a strand of hair loose across her cheek. Neither of them reached for it. Neither looked away. On the ride back, clouds gathered low in the west. The air took on that waiting feel again, as if weather and memory were always traveling this land together. They had nearly reached the ranch when Wyatt slowed his horse and looked over at her. "Mara." She steadied the mare and met his eyes. "What?" He said it without flourish, without warning. That seemed to be his way when something mattered. "When I asked you the first day if you wanted work or to wear white beside me, I wasn't making sport." "I know. I'd ask the same now." Her breath caught. The horses shifted under them. Leather creaked. Wind moved through the dry grass in a long hush. Mara stared at him, at the man who had offered her dignity before affection and safety before claim. No sweet talk, no games, just a quiet, serious heart standing in front of her again. "Wyatt," she said, and then stopped because she did not know how to put all of it into words. Fear, want, gratitude, the children, the past, the simple fact that she had only just begun to feel the ground steady under her feet again. He seemed to understand even before she spoke. "I don't need your answer today." She let out the breath she had been holding. "Good." One corner of his mouth moved. "You think on it anyway." "I already have." That changed something in his face. Not surprise. more like a quiet acknowledgement that they were standing nearer to the edge of truth than either of them had planned. Back at the house, Lottie came running to meet them, and Caleb followed with both hands sticky from preserves Mrs. Pritchard had sent home in a jar. The ordinary sight of them broke the tension just enough for Mara to breathe again. She slid from the saddle and Wyatt took the reins from her without a word. Their fingers brushed once. Neither mentioned it. That evening the wind rose after supper. The children went asleep early, worn out from play and sugar. Mara stayed on the porch after dark with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the yard fade into shadow. The house behind her was warm. The bunkhouse lamp glowed low through the small window. Somewhere in the barn, a chain knocked softly against wood. Wyatt stepped out carrying a second blanket and draped it over the back of the chair beside her. He did not sit right away. "You'll freeze if you mean to stay out here much longer." "I was thinking. That usually looks colder than it is." She looked up at him. "You make marriage sound like fence repair. It's more useful if it's built the same way." That made her smile in spite of herself. Wyatt finally sat beside her, elbows on his knees, looking out into the dark. "I won't press you," he said after a while, "but I need you to know something." She waited. "If I ask again, it won't be because you need saving." His voice stayed even, but there was force under it now. "It'll be because when you walk into a room, it feels less empty. Because your children laugh here like they belong. Because I trust your hands in my house and your word in my yard. Because I don't want to go back to eating alone if I can help it." The night seemed to go still around them. Mara felt tears rise so suddenly she was angry at them for a second. She blinked hard and kept her gaze on the dark field ahead. "No one's ever asked me like that," she said. "Then they've all been fools." She laughed once through the sting in her eyes. Then the laugh faded, and she spoke the truth as plainly as she could. "I'm scared of wanting this." Wyatt nodded. "I know. And if I say yes one day, it'll be because I mean it, not because winter's coming. That's the only kind of yes I'd take." She turned to him then. The porch light caught the hard line of his jaw and the tired kindness in his eyes. She wanted, suddenly and fiercely, to lean into him, to test what it would feel like to rest. She did not. Not yet. Instead, she let her hand slip from under the blanket and rest on the bench between them. Wyatt looked down. After one quiet second, he set his hand over hers. No hurry, no claim, just warmth. The contact was so simple it almost undid her. They sat that way a long time while the wind moved over the prairie and the cold deepened and the world kept its own counsel. Mara did not pull her hand away. Wyatt did not tighten his hold. But when she finally rose to go in, the shape of her life felt changed again, gently but for good. He had asked no new promise from her. Still, for the first time since she had crossed that yard with stolen eggs in her hands, Mara knew the truth with no place left to hide from it. If he asked again, she was not sure she would say no. Snow came early that year. It started as a thin white dust over the pasture one morning, then turned serious by nightfall. By the second day the yard was half buried, the fence rails wore soft white caps, and the path from the bunkhouse to the main house had to be stamped down again and again just to keep from vanishing. Mara stood at the kitchen window with a dish towel in her hand and watched the flakes blow sideways past the glass. Winter on the prairie had a way of swallowing distance. The world grew smaller. A person either drew closer to what was theirs, or they learned how lonely a house could sound under snow. Behind her, Caleb slept in a chair by the stove with his toy horse in his lap. Lottie sat on the floor with her knees tucked up, mending one of Caleb's socks with more effort than skill. Wyatt came in through the back door carrying cold on his coat and snow across the shoulders. He stomped his boots once on the mat, set down a split armload of wood, and glanced toward the children before looking at Mara. "North side drifted high," he said. "Barn door nearly stuck. I'll heat more stew." He nodded but did not move right away. Mara turned from the window and noticed the line between his brows. Something wrong. "One heifer's due soon, bad weather for it." Mara set the towel down at once. "You think she'll make it?" Maybe he pulled off his gloves, maybe not without help. The room went quiet except for the tick of snow against the panes. Mara knew that look on his face now. It was the one he got when worry had already been weighed and pushed aside because work needed doing first. She crossed to the stove, filled a bowl and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed. His were cold enough to make her flinch. "You eat," she said. "Then I'll help however I can." Wyatt looked at her for 1 second longer than usual. "You'll freeze." "I've been colder." That answer stayed with him. She could see it did. He took the bowl and ate standing up, quick and silent, while the children watched with that solemn stillness children fall into when grown folks are carrying weather in their voices. Lottie set the sock aside and rose. "I can keep Caleb by the fire." Mara looked at her daughter. The girl had grown steadier these past weeks, less pinched, less afraid. It showed most in the way she spoke now, as if the world might answer her without striking. Mara touched her cheek. "You stay inside, both of you." Wyatt finished the stew, set the bowl down, and headed for the door. Mara was already reaching for her shawl and heavier coat. He saw it and frowned. "I said maybe. And I heard maybe not." He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. In the end he only waited while she wrapped the shawl tight and pulled on gloves that had been mended twice already. When they stepped out into the yard, the wind hit like a thrown sheet of ice. Mara lowered her head and followed Wyatt toward the barn through the drifting white. Inside, the smell of hay, animals, and cold wood wrapped around them all at once. The heifer was down in the far stall, sides trembling, breath blowing hard. Wyatt crouched near her shoulder, checking position with careful hands. Mara stood close, trying to calm her own breathing. The animal's eyes rolled once, wild with pain. "She's early," Wyatt said. "Calf's turned wrong." Mara knelt opposite him, the straw biting through her skirt. "Tell me what you need." He looked up. There was surprise there, but not doubt. "Hold her steady, talk to her if you can." Mara set a hand against the heifer's neck, murmuring low nonsense and comfort in the same voice she had used over feverish children and frightened horses. Wyatt worked with hard focus, his jaw set, his hands sure even when the task turned ugly. Time lost shape in that stall. Snow rattled at the barn walls. The lantern swung faintly overhead. At one point Mara's knees went numb from the cold ground, but she did not move. Then all at once the calf came, small, slick, still for 1 terrible second too long. Wyatt cleared the nose and mouth, rubbed hard, and Mara held her breath so fiercely it hurt. Then the calf jolted and dragged in its first thin cry. The sound cut through the barn like grace. Mara laughed before she realized she was doing it. Wyatt sat back on his heels with straw in his hair and blood on his sleeves and let out one short breath that almost sounded like relief becoming life again. Their eyes met across the stall. Neither spoke. They did not need to. They had just hauled something living through winter. By the time they got back to the house, night had fallen. Lottie had done exactly as told. Caleb was asleep under a blanket by the stove, and the lamp had been turned low to save oil. Mara helped Wyatt strip off his wet coat and hang it near the fire. Snow was melting off her own hem, making a dark half circle on the floorboards. "You should change before you turn to ice," Wyatt said. "So should you." That nearly drew a smile out of him. He went to the wash basin while Mara changed behind the bedroom screen into a dry dress and thicker stockings. When she came back into the kitchen, Wyatt was sitting at the table in a clean shirt, his hair still damp from washing, one forearm resting on the wood. He looked tired in a way she had not seen before. Not weak, just worn honest through. Mara ladled out stew and set a bowl in front of him. Then she sat across from him with her own. The children slept on, one near the stove, one curled on the pallet with a book fallen open against her chest. For a long minute the only sounds were spoons against bowls and the wind moving around the outside walls. Finally Wyatt said, "You didn't have to come." Mara looked up. "I know. I mean it. I know that too." He held her gaze. Firelight moved across his face, softening nothing, only showing it clearer. "Still glad you did." That settled low in her chest. Me too. After supper, Mara rose to lift Caleb and carry him to the pallet. The boy stirred just enough to tuck his face against her shoulder. When she straightened, Wyatt was watching her with an expression she could not read all at once. Not longing exactly. Not only that. Something fuller, more rooted. "What?" she asked. "You look like you belong here." The words went through her so cleanly she had to turn away for a second. Belong, she had wanted food, shelter, dry boards, a place for the children to sleep without fear. She had not let herself ask for belonging. That was too large a thing, too easily broken. When she faced him again, her voice came out quiet. "That feels dangerous to hear." Wyatt did not look away. "It's still true." Later that night the snow stopped. The silence after a storm was always deeper than the storm itself. Mara stepped out onto the porch before bed, drawn by that white stillness spread over everything. The yard glowed under starlight. The barn roof shone pale. Even the old fence seemed gentler under snow. She heard the door behind her and knew before turning that it was Wyatt. He came out carrying a blanket and set it around her shoulders without asking. The weight of it settled warm over her back. "You'll freeze out here," he said. "You've said that before. And you've ignored it before." She smiled faintly and looked across the yard. "The calf will make it." "Looks that way." They stood shoulder to shoulder in the cold, not touching beyond the blanket brushing his sleeve. Yet the nearness felt fuller than many embraces Mara had known in her life. Wyatt rested his forearms on the porch rail and looked out over the sleeping ranch. "When my mother died," he said, "my father stopped speaking for near a year except when work demanded it." Mara turned her head. He had never spoken of his family. "He kept the place going," Wyatt continued, "fed us, fixed what broke, did everything right that a person could point at, but the house felt empty even when he was standing in it." He paused. "I promised myself if I ever had a home of my own, I'd make sure it held more than walls." Mara let that settle. "Is that what this is to you now, home?" He looked at her then. "Yes." Her throat tightened. She stared down at her gloved hands resting on the rail. Snow had caught in the seam near one thumb and was melting there. "I've been afraid to say that word." "Why?" She gave a small breath. "Because every time I thought I had one, it shifted, or I did." Wyatt nodded like he had expected that answer. "Then don't say it yet." She frowned slightly and looked at him. He went on in the same quiet voice. "You don't owe a word before you're ready, but Mara." He waited until she met his eyes. "You're not standing on air here." The truth of that hurt, not in a bad way. In the way warmth hurts frozen hands. She felt tears rise again and hated them less this time. Wyatt reached up as if to touch her face, then stopped halfway, giving her the choice even now. Mara closed the distance herself. It was only a small step. Still, it felt like crossing a year of fear. Wyatt's hand came to rest against her cheek, rough and warm. He did not rush the moment. He held it the way he held reins. Steady. Certain. Giving nothing up to chance. Mara leaned into his palm before she could think better of it. Her eyes slipped shut. The porch, the snow, the whole white world around them seemed to go quiet under the sound of her own heart. When he kissed her, it was not hungry. It was not tentative either. It was the kind of kiss a person gives after deciding something true and meaning to honor it. Mara's fingers tightened in the blanket at her shoulders. She had been kissed before in her life, had been held, had been wanted. But this felt different from all of it. This felt like being asked and answered at once. When they parted, neither moved far. Mara's breath came unsteady. "That was a poor time to find out I can't think straight in the cold." Something changed in Wyatt's face then. A real smile, brief but unmistakable. "Then come inside before you make any worse decisions." She laughed softly, the sound misting into the winter air. But before she turned toward the door, she caught his sleeve. "Wyatt." He waited. "If you ask me again," she said, "don't do it because we kissed." He shook his head once. "Wouldn't." "Ask because you still mean it." His gaze held hers. "I always will." She believed him. That was the thing that changed everything. Not the kiss, not even the promise. It was the belief settling where fear had lived, quiet, strong, without spectacle. Mara went inside with the blanket still around her shoulders and the taste of winter and hope still on her lips. Behind her, Wyatt shut the door against the cold. The house held the warmth. The children slept safe. The wind stayed outside where it belonged. And for the first time since the road had broken her open, Mara let herself want not just tomorrow, but the years beyond it. 3 mornings later, the preacher came through snow. Mara saw him first from the kitchen window, a dark shape moving slow along the white road, horse picking careful steps through the drift. The sight made her still all over. She had known this moment was coming, ever since the porch. Ever since Wyatt's hand at her cheek and the kiss that had settled something deep instead of stirring it into confusion. Still, seeing the preacher ride toward the house turned quiet thought into living fact. She stood with flour on her hands and looked out at the yard that no longer felt borrowed. Lottie came up beside her and peered through the glass. "Who's that?" Mara swallowed once. "A preacher." Lottie's eyes widened. Then she looked up at her mother with a sharp little understanding children sometimes have before they have the words for it. "Today." Mara gave the smallest nod. Behind them, Caleb was on the floor near the stove pushing his wooden horse through a patch of light. He looked up only when the kitchen door opened and Wyatt stepped in from the porch. Snow clung to his boots and shoulders. His face was calm, but Mara had learned him well enough now to see the extra stillness in him. Not doubt, resolve. "The preacher's near the gate," he said. Mara turned to face him fully. For one heartbeat neither spoke. The children were in the room. The fire was burning. Dough waited on the table. It should have felt like an ordinary winter morning. Instead, it felt like the edge of a life shifting into another shape. "You still mean it?" she asked. Wyatt looked straight at her. "I do." She wiped her hands on her apron, though they were already clean. "Then, so do I." Lottie let out a sharp breath that might have become a squeal if she had not caught herself in time. Caleb blinked between them, uncertain, then grinned because everyone else in the room looked brighter than usual. Wyatt's gaze never left Mara's. The thing she loved most about him, she realized in that instant, was that he did not fill important moments with too much noise. He let them stand under their own weight. The preacher was a spare man with a red nose from the cold and a Bible tucked under one arm. He came in stamping snow from his boots and accepted coffee before anything else. Wyatt introduced him as Reverend Pike. Mara liked him at once because he did not fuss. He looked around the kitchen, took in the children, the warmth, the simple order of the room, and seemed to understand this was no grand wedding. It was something quieter and truer. There was no white dress. Mara had known there would not be. She wore her best dark blue dress, the one she had mended so many times the seams were more her own work than the original maker's. Lottie stood beside her with her hair smoothed back, and a ribbon Mara had saved for nearly a year tied at the end of one braid. Caleb had been washed, buttoned, and worn twice to keep his hands off the syrup jar. Wyatt wore a clean shirt and his black coat. He had shaved. The sight of that struck Mara in a soft place. Men did not go to that trouble for things they took lightly. They stood near the hearth because it was the warmest place in the house. Snow light came pale through the windows. The fire gave off a low, steady heat. Reverend Pike opened the Bible and began in a voice that was plain and familiar, the kind shaped more by weather and road than by grand churches. Mara listened, but not to the words alone. She listened to the sound of Caleb shifting his boots, to Lottie's careful breathing, to the pop of wood in the stove, to Wyatt's silence beside her, which no longer felt like space between them but like ground under both their feet. When the preacher asked if she came to this freely, Mara did not hesitate. Yes. That one word carried more than he could know. Hunger, fear, miles walked, nights without shelter. The first morning with stolen eggs in her hands. The first real meal her children had eaten in days. Wyatt defending her in town. Wyatt binding her cut hand. Wyatt offering not rescue but choice. She was not speaking yes to a roof. She was speaking yes to being seen and not turned away. Wyatt's answer came just as steady. "I do." Reverend Pike nodded as if he had expected nothing less. He said the rest, gave the blessing, and closed the Bible. There was no ring. Mara had told Wyatt she did not need one. He had only looked at her for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a braided leather cord, dark with age, smoothed at the edges from being held often. "My mother made this for my father," he said. "He carried it till he died. Then I kept it." Mara's throat tightened. He wrapped the cord twice around her wrist and tied it with sure fingers. It was not gold. It was not town fine. It meant more than either. Lottie smiled so hard her whole face changed. Caleb looked at the cord and asked in a whisper much louder than he meant, "Does that mean Ma stays here forever?" No one laughed at him. Mara looked down at her boy and knelt so she was eye level. "Yes," she said softly, "if you want that." Caleb frowned as if the answer were obvious. "I do." That broke the last of the tightness in the room. Even Reverend Pike smiled. Wyatt rested one hand on Caleb's shoulder, then looked at Lottie too, not as a man merely tolerating children because they came with the woman he loved, but as a man already thinking how to make room for all three of them in every season ahead. Mara saw it. She would never stop being moved by it. After the preacher left with a sack of flour and a jar of preserves for his trouble, the house grew quiet again. The kind of quiet that comes after something holy has happened without anyone needing to call it that. Lottie helped set bowls on the table. Caleb ran his toy horse along the edge of the bench until Mara gave him one look and he stopped at once. Wyatt stood by the stove for a moment, one hand resting on the mantel as if even he needed time to let the truth settle. Mara crossed the room and stopped in front of him. The children were near. Daylight still filled the house. Yet the moment felt private in the best way. "So," she said, and her voice shook just enough to make her smile at herself. "Am I working or wearing white?" Wyatt looked down at the blue dress, then back at her face. "Looks to me like you're doing both in your own style." She laughed, and there it was again, that free sound that had once felt impossible inside her own chest. Wyatt's hand came up to her cheek. He kissed her forehead first. A simple thing. It nearly undid her more than the porch kiss had. The rest of that day passed with a kind of gentle brightness she knew she would remember all her life. Soup on the stove, bread in the oven, snow piled high outside, Lottie humming while she wiped the table, Caleb falling asleep before supper because excitement had worn him out faster than chores ever could. Small things. Yet that was the whole point of the life Mara had said yes to. It would be built mostly from small things done steadily and kindly, not grand promises flung into the air. Not passion that burned hot and vanished, daily bread, honest work, doors shut against winter, one person's hand reaching for another's because both of them meant to stay. That night after the children were carried to the bunkhouse with enough quilts to turn it warm, Mara stood in the main room and looked around as if seeing it for the first time. Wyatt had lit only one lamp. Shadows moved soft along the walls. The table still held the marks of years of use. Her apron hung by the door now beside his hat. Her blue shawl was folded over the chair back. Signs. That was what belonging looked like in the end. Not one moment, but many signs gathered together until leaving would feel stranger than staying. Wyatt came up behind her quietly, as he always did, and stopped near enough that she could feel the heat of him before he touched her. "What are you thinking?" She rested her fingers lightly on the leather cord at her wrist. "That I almost walked past this place with your eggs." He gave a low breath that might have been a laugh. "You did walk onto it with my eggs." She turned and looked up at him. "And you still let me stay." "I told you before," he said. "You tried to pay." "No." She shook her head slowly. "You let me stay because you're the kind of man who looks at what's under a thing." His eyes held hers. "And what do you see under me?" The answer came easier than she expected. "A man who means what he says. A man who makes a house feel less lonely. A man my children already trust. A man I can rest beside without fearing what morning will bring." Something softened in his face then, something deeper than pride. Gratitude, perhaps, or love made humble by being returned. He touched the leather cord once with the back of his fingers, then let his hand slide down and fold around hers. Outside, wind moved over the snow in long, low whispers. Inside, the stove held steady. Wyatt drew her closer. Mara laid her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, slow and sure, like boots on solid ground. She thought of the woman she had been when she first stepped into his yard, half wild from hunger, ready to be sent away. She thought of the children thin under worn blankets. She thought of all the times she had believed survival was the best she could ask of life. She knew better now. By spring the yard would soften, the creek would swell, and the chickens would wander out into thawed earth again. Lottie would grow taller. Caleb would chase calves and come in muddy. Mara would plant herbs by the porch and bake enough bread that the kitchen would never smell empty. Wyatt would mend fences, stack wood, and pause at the doorway every evening before supper just long enough to find her with his eyes. Life would not become easy. Prairie life never did, but it would be theirs. Joined, chosen, held. Much later, people in town would tell the story wrong. They would say Wyatt Granger married a starving widow he caught stealing eggs. It made for a neat tale, and towns liked neat tales. But that was never the whole truth. The truth was plainer and better. A tired woman walked onto a ranch carrying hunger in both hands. A man offered her work, choice, and dignity before he ever offered love. Then, piece by piece, with weather and labor and patience, they built something stronger than either could have made alone. And every winter after that, when snow gathered along the fence rails and white silence covered the prairie, Mara would sometimes stand at the kitchen window with Wyatt beside her and look out across the yard where everything had begun. She would feel the leather cord at her wrist. She would hear her children laughing in the next room. She would remember warm eggs, a lowered rifle, and the first impossible kindness that changed all the years ahead. This was the thing she had wanted all along, though she had never dared name it. Not rescue, not luck, a place that held.